day, 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 day,
Podcast.
All right.
Yeah.
Happy day. It's
Happy-
another Daily Solutions. I'm Graham,
I'm Ashkan.
and today's question is, can you explain the pros/cons, C-O-N-S, not
Slash cons,
K-A-H-N-S,
huh?
yeah, of different types of heating systems in a tank?
Okay. Yes, I can. So
Well, hit it.
here we go.
Buckle in, everyone.
So there's different types of heating systems in tanks. And those mostly break down into two categories. Maybe three categories.
I was going to say maybe three.
So there's like some sort of heating pad, heating coil, heating something that goes like probably on the outside of your actual float tank tub, whether it's on the bottom, underneath the tub, around the sides, embedded into the fiberglass, actually inside the tub with a liner above it, whatever the situation is. There's kind of some sort of heating pad thing that's connected to the float tank itself that is heating the liquid inside of it. So that's kind of one type of heater. I usually just call them under tank heaters. It's not.
Even though they go around the sides.
Yeah,
stuff
sometimes
like
they
that,
go around the
whatever it is.
sides.
Yeah,
It's not the most accurate thing in the world, but yeah, just for a name for us to use.
just for convenience.
And then there's another type of heater that are called either inline heaters or circulation heaters.
Sometimes black magic heaters.
Never,
No, that's
never
not
black
actually what they're
magic
called,
heaters.
yeah.
But those are heaters that are built into the plumbing of your filtration system. So they have an actual like heating coil, and the float solution will rush through the pipes, and at some point it'll go through that section of heater and go right against this heating coil and be heated up, and continue on its way through your pipes.
And a lot of tanks also have a combination of those two.
Right.
as
But
well,
what's the
would be.
third? What's the third type?
What I was going to say hydronic. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to say something different than that. There's also heaters for the rest of the float tank. So some float tanks have like radiant heaters built into the ceiling or the wall panels above the water line, or something to treat the air and heating that to get its way into the system. And those are just a lot more kind of like, this tank has this thing going on, this tank has that thing going on. Most tanks probably have none of these things. Like it's kind of a little bit more of a nebulous category.
Mm-hmm. And hydronic heating is actually kind of a form of under tank heater as well. It's just done rather than having an electric element that's heating the water through some kind of source directly. You're running water or some kind of liquid through a hose that's kind of wrapped around your tank, or sometimes on the inside bottom of your tank, and you're actually heating the water that's going around. And that's kind of nice because you're not creating giant electromagnetic fields within the float tank. And if there's, if something goes wrong, you don't have electricity in totally close contact with your water. It's just, there's now water leaking into your water from your water hose. So it's kind of cool. Again, almost like a subdivision of what I'd call under tank heaters. So kind of just that constant heating, but a
Yeah.
cool way to accomplish it.
And pretty rare.
Super rare.
I don't know. I actually don't know of any float tanks off the top of my head.
I know a couple manufacturers were trying to
Trying
do it,
to
and
do
I know
it.
some. I know
Did it
some.
for a little bit and then switched to.
Yeah, but I know
electrical heating
at least a
pads.
couple custom kind of builds that
Yeah.
have done it themselves,
I've
but
seen
no
them custom builds.
manufacturers. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely like not something you're very likely going to run across if you were to buy a float tank from a commercial manufacturer.
But if you drop that term to a manufacturer, they'll be super stoked and probably tell you about how that's exactly what they wanted to do before they figured out how hard it was, because it is very attractive in the float industry.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
If you want a nerdy conversation, it's a good one to bring up.
Okay, so let's talk about the two biggest things here: the inline or circulation heater
Yep.
versus kind of the under tank heater. The single biggest difference that's really like exists between those two things is that the inline heaters can only heat the water while your float tank is running its pump.
Mm-hmm.
So like in between floaters, when you kick that pump on, that's the only time water is really kind of gushing through the pipes in your filtration system. And that usually the button that runs your pump will also give power to the heating element of the inline heater.
And so that's con number one.
Yeah.
We'll say is that it can't heat the water when someone is floating, unless you have like a rare float tank that has some kind of like low flow pump where it's active when people are in there, which is almost none of them. So for
Right.
the most part, like having an inline heater means you can only heat the tank in between clients, not at all when someone's floating.
Which, there are some float tanks out there that only have inline heaters, and you can do a lot of insulation and stuff like that to maintain the temperature, but it can still get hard. Like, we've done really long floats at our float center, 7.5 hours, 8.5 hours, 24 hours.
Yep, just yesterday, another 24-hour one.
Yep. so when you're doing stuff like that, I think it'd be real hard to have a float tank that only had an inline heater be able to do kind of these like epically long floats. And other than that, there's a lot of advantages to inline heaters. They're a lot more efficient because, I mean, if you think about it, you have a heating coil in direct contact with the water that it's trying to heat, as opposed to these like heating pads that have to heat through fiberglass.
Which is itself an insulatory material. Like you're actually designing a system that has to heat through insulation
to try to
which is
get
kind
to
of
the
crazy,
water.
Yeah.
So, not only for your energy bill, but also you can heat the float tank up way faster with an inline heater than you can with an under tank heater.
And I'd say, like, in my opinion, that's the number one benefit.
Yeah.
Like the ability to get that water up, especially if something went wrong or just when you're filling new tanks or whatever. Like sometimes waiting, like your water's really dense, so it doesn't want to change temperature, like even more so than regular water. So having something where you can kind of just turn on that supercharge mode and actually kick it up a few degrees in, a matter of minutes is way better than you'll get from any under tank heater.
My guess for under tank heaters is they can probably heat a degree Fahrenheit in maybe an hour.
I think that's probably pretty average, yeah.
At the temperatures we're like when you're around float tank temperatures, to get from like 93 to 94 degrees Fahrenheit, like that might take like about an hour. I mean, it's going to differ tank by tank and all that stuff. And like you were saying, inline heaters, that's probably going to take a minute. So we're talking about, significantly faster. So when you're filling your tanks up from scratch, or, if a customer wants it warmer, like you have a lot more flexibility with those inline heaters.
Yeah, which again is very powerful. Like in my mind, that's number one benefit for sure.
Yeah. The other big advantage of inline heaters is if something goes wrong, they're way easier to fix. They're just like,
oh yeah, that's a good one.
They're just out. They're just a part of your plumbing and your filtration system. Something goes wrong, you just take that part of the system off, and you can put a whole new one there. You can fix whatever. They're a lot easier to access. Your under tank heaters are under your tank, or even if they're in the wall panels or something like that. Like they're generally not the easiest things in the world to access and replace.
No, and it is one thing that I do like about the under tank heaters that wrap around the side or that aren't actually under your tank. Because man, when a heater under your tank gives out and that's the only heater you have, it means you need to lift up your float tank somehow, which usually means a decent amount of decocking things and deconstruction and lifting. And
it's a huge project.
A day to days of not having that tank be operable at all, just while you're replacing the heater.
Yeah, and if you just have little ball valves or some sort of check valve on either side of an inline heater, like you don't even have to empty your float tank.
No,
You're
it's
just
like
like
you
twisting
could,
two things, and now you can like remove this section. And it's just a lot easier to deal with when something goes wrong.
If you had a backup, you could switch an inline heater probably just in the course of a float session and be down for.
Yeah, there's like the electrical part, depending on how it's wired in.
Yeah,
But the rest of the system, that might
if
be
you actually have to
more
wire
or
directly
less
into the wall or
difficult.
something like that. Yeah.
Because they're almost always like wired into the control box somehow to.
So that when the entire thing kicks on, it'll.
Yeah. So, but even that is like it's just the scope of fixing them is so much easier than the scope of fixing an under tank heater. Usually, every float tank is there's always like an exception to these things with various float tank design out there. And this is the reason why some float tanks, especially like nowadays the newer ones, seem to just be coming with both. Like people just throw an inline and an under tank heater on there, and then you just kind of get the benefits of both worlds, which is nice.
And backup for both too.
Yeah.
Inline heater goes down, you still have a backup under tank, and vice versa, which is really nice.
Yeah, and there's a few tanks that only come with inline heaters, and there's a lot of tanks that only come with under tank heaters. So if you're gonna have one heating type, by far the more common is something that's kind of heating the tub itself.
And if you do decide that you want to retrofit your tank and get an inline heater, that is something like that's, with some adding in pipe length and making sure you're doing it right. Like that's a little customization mod that you can do on your float tank too. Like adding in an inline heater is not the craziest thing in the world.
Yeah, as long as you also consider the electrical load, because they want to use up a lot of electricity.
Heaters are purposefully inefficient. So they really want to crank through it. Yeah, for sure.
And then just to touch on the other category, like the air conditioning of hair for humidity and for heat and stuff like that. Again, you see that stuff a lot less commonly, but to me, it's kind of one of the cooler things that I see happening more as the float industry grows, as manufacturers are starting to dig a little deeper into like actually having devices that control air temperature, control humidity, radiant heating in the ceiling panels. I know Somadi's been doing that for a long time. So they've had something like that, and that's kind of like more like an infrared heat, so not creating humidity but creating heat. So there's all sorts of different things like that, and it's important to consider because when people say they're cold, there might have nothing to do with the water. Your water might have been a great temperature, and it might have been the air was not humid enough or too humid or not warm enough. All those things can lead to the perception of temperature being off, and we tend to focus a lot on the water and not quite as much on the air, where I think the air is just as big of a part of someone feeling warm or cold in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And like even though it's not directly temperature related, you might even put like variable airflow in with that, right? Like all it takes is a little bit of a breeze, and all of a sudden it's way cooler inside the float tank versus things being relatively static. So sort of like a tangential variable that affects perceived temperature in there.
So yeah, it'll be cool to see that stuff continue to get more and more robust as manufacturers kind of take on more of the challenge of really directly dealing with ventilation and air temperature and humidity.
Yeah. And that's it?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
For tank heaters? Yeah, I think so.
If you have other questions about things getting hot and heavy, you can go ahead and send them to us, floatanksolutions.com/podcast.
And we will talk to you tomorrow.
Yeah, we will.
Bye, everyone.